Ken, let's talk a little bit about the fifth Sunday of Lent and concentrate on the gospel reading for that day. It's from the 8th chapter of John's Gospel, verses 1 to 11. It is the familiar story of the woman taken in adultery and Jesus' merciful reactions to her. But before we do that, I think there are certain problems with this that we have to look at. First of all, we notice that in this year of Luke, we have moved to John's Gospel, which does happen on big feasts throughout the year, doesn't it? I mean, very often when there's extra solemnity or certain times, there's a tendency in the church to move to John's Gospel, and we have an example of that here. That's one thing, so we're out of that pattern. But then there's another problem that emerges from the fact that it appears as though that in the earliest manuscripts we have of John's Gospel that this particular passage is missing. And that raises up a whole field that I'd like you to comment on a little bit that we commonly call textual criticism. That's the attempt to reconstruct the original text to find out exactly how close we can get back to those original manuscripts. So maybe you could just fill us in a little bit on what we call textual criticism.
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. The underlying fact to remember is that all our early manuscripts were made before the printing press was invented, and so they were all hand-copied. In the process of copying by hand, a long text at least, it's inevitable that people make copying mistakes. Everyone who copies from that mistaken copy then will incorporate that copy and probably make a few mistakes of his or her own, which will then be part of the next copy, which will be copied. And as a consequence, the further one gets from the original copies, in theory at least, the more mistakes tend to creep into the texts. Most mistakes tend to be fairly minor little things, spelling mistakes, or a person reads his eye does not look carefully and thinks that they saw one word when actually they saw another, or something skips a couple words or a line, especially if the same word occurs twice very close together. When the person reading the original copy he reads the top line, then he writes down on the copy he's writing. When he looks back to the original again, his eye can catch maybe the second time the word occurs rather than the first, and he ends up skipping some passages in between. Because the people who did the copying, especially after a period of time, knew the stories very well, this was both a blessing and a curse, you might say. Sometimes it was a curse because they thought they remembered the stories very well, and they may have remembered, for example, a given incident the way Mark tells the story, and they're copying Matthew, and by accident they think they see what they really remember in their mind as another version of the story. That causes some problems. But sometimes it's a blessing because people notice, and the copyist in copying notices, hey, something's missing here. I remember this passage. And if it's a case of some monks in a monastery or something where there might be another copy of the same text around, they can go and check that copy. If they find then that indeed this exemplar is missing some words, they could put that in the margin, for example, and that the subsequent copyists from that manuscript then would include the words. But that could be a problem because sometimes they would copy those same words at a wrong place in the new copy that was made. And another problem, which is really intriguing, is that sometimes that's where the owner of the manuscript would write comments to himself. He would write footnotes to himself or observations in the margins. A subsequent copyist sometimes did not realize that those were the owner's comments rather than the original text, and would very blithely copy them right into the text itself.
So somebody hearing all of that, Ken, could end up saying, wait a second here, do we really have the text as it would have been earliest written down? I think probably it's helpful to make a general kind of comment that after the scholars reconstruct the text, looks at the various copies found in different parts of the world and so on, have generally figured out what the original text is, and we have rather strong scholarly opinion that in most cases we've been able to get back pretty much to the earliest text that we would have had. Remember that the New Testament is written in Greek, and the earliest fragments we have, as I'm recalling, it would come as early as 125 in the Common Era, I think. And when would we have full texts? That was fragments that I'm remembering, but already in the 2nd century, don't we have full text?
The really good full texts occurred in the 3rd century, I think, is the first time we have major text. But we have copies of individual books or individual sections earlier than that. That is true. Yes, I on the one hand, we could say there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of variants, all kinds of variants. But the other side of that, as you were alluding there, that does not mean that we have to throw up our hands and say we don't know anything about the original text. Most of the discrepancies are very, very minor. And the work of the text critic is, as you suggested, was to analyze all these different manuscripts from one end of the Mediterranean to the other, and by putting them together and seeing what the discrepancies are, the critics can work out a family tree for the manuscript. That feature that I just mentioned, that every manuscript will incorporate the mistakes made in the previous manuscript as well as adding its own, allows us then, by comparing those discrepancies, those variants, to work out a family tree, which manuscript is copied from which manuscript, and we work out families of manuscripts. So that when the bottom line is drawn, we really have excellent assurances about the state of our text. Because it is the Scriptures, we want to have them perfect, so the textual critics always have a job to do. But there's the listeners here should not draw the conclusion that we have no idea at all what the text
right,
talks
so we
about.
have substantially correct text
That's
as a
correct.
result of scholarly efforts. Now, we have a specific problem with this passage in John's Gospel that we're referring to about the woman taken in adultery, and that is that it sort of got lost, as one scholar said. This story went underground. The feelings of the scholars, I believe, is that this indeed is a very early tradition, that this is a very good example of something that Jesus really would have said and done, that there's a lot of historical veracity in this passage. But for some reason or another, it might have gone underground or been submerged. And one of the theories is because the early church in certain places was trying to emphasize the stability of marriage and trying to make sure that the Christian community didn't fall into laxity. And there was the fear that this story, in one way or another, would play into the hands of laxity, that, well, this woman taken in adultery, and Jesus sort of condoning it, fine, go ahead, and everything's fine, and that therefore the early church was worried that it would be misused to keep away from the high ideals that the community was trying to establish.
That's right. I think in order to understand a situation like this, we have to keep reminding ourselves that the Gospel originally circulated as independent stories about Jesus, that the Gospel writers, the evangelists, out of all that repertory of stories that their community was aware of and that they treasured, chose those particular ones to make the points that they thought that their community needed to be reminded of or needed to hear. Well, this is an example of a story about Jesus that circulated very early, has all the earmarks of a very reliable story about Jesus, and yet it was not included in any of the four Gospels. But it was just too good to lose. And as a consequence, we find it wandering over the manuscripts. Some manuscripts have it in a couple different places in John. One family of manuscripts even has it in Luke's Gospel.
Which is
so
interesting.
It's not so far.
As someone said that it really feels like Luke. It sounds
That's right.
a lot like Luke's Gospel, and so that maybe some people feel it really fits into that place. So at least some scribes or thought that that's where it belonged, so they put it in Luke. I think they place it in the 21st chapter of Luke,
That's right.
as a matter of fact.
Which is where it would fit, historically or chronologically speaking. Jesus would be in the... You're quite correct about that. There's a number of expressions, just the opening couple sentences. Jesus went up to the Mount of Olives. This is the only place where Mount of Olives occurs in John's Gospel. And it happened at daybreak or through. That word is used only in Luke and Acts. The scribes and the Pharisees bring this woman to him. That's the only time that phrase occurs in John's Gospel. It's found in Luke and the other synoptics over and over again. But as you go through the passage, you just find phrase after phrase that are very typical of the way Luke tells stories and quite different from John's normal approach. But eventually, as I said, the manuscripts find the story settling in at the end of chapter 7, at the beginning of chapter 8. It's now numbered, chapter 8, verses 1 to 11 or so. It probably was, I don't think any scholar would say today that was written by John. It's one of those independent stories about Jesus that was circulating.
Yeah, that's a very good point that you made before, and it deserves re-emphasis, I think, that the gospel material comes to us in terms of short pericopes, or stories, as they say, story forms. You can imagine in the early church, before the Gospels are written, and we would say Mark's Gospel written around 70, and Luke and Matthew in the middle 80s, and John in the 90s. Well, you've got a long period of time where Christian communities are gathering, and people come together to celebrate the liturgy, and they tell the stories of Jesus. The missionaries go out and preach, and they have the material sort of stylized into story forms. And so you can sort of pick and choose out of those. And then what the evangelists eventually did is take this great variety and pick and put it together in their gospel. Someone had used the analogy, it was like finding a lot of pictures in a trunk in an attic. And
yes.
that here you open up the trunk, and here there's some pictures. Oh, this was all on our vacation. All of these pictures fit into that one vacation 5 years ago, and then all these other pictures are of a particular person. Yeah, these are all Aunt Helen's pictures. And the evangelist was faced with that, and having one long story in there, or one big picture, which is the Passion narratives, and then putting it all together in one way or another. Maybe it gives a little feeling for how the evangelist was working. And
it's an excellent analogy, because you could see right away that different persons could put the pictures together in different ways. One person could try to do a chronology, take the picture of Aunt Helen from the time that she was a little baby all the way to the time she was an adult. Someone else could group it by important events. These are our vacations. These are the pictures about our Christmas celebrations. These are the times that we were at the lake, whatever the case might be. And so you end up with different total stories, but all made up of the same individual elements. Someone else has used the analogy of like stringing beads, which is the same kind of an idea, that the individual element remains the same, but it's put in different settings in the various Gospels. And that explains, for example, why Matthew, Mark, and Luke can tell the same stories about Jesus, but the order in which they occur can be quite different depending on which Gospel writer is, how they're using them.
And the context becomes a little different, and that colors the story.
That's correct.
Well, go ahead. Did you want to say more about textual criticism?
I just wanted to add one other thing, that this is an example of also the difference between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. We find that not only is this passage not found in any of the manuscripts that circulated in the East, there's no comments by the commentators on this passage for a full 1,000 years.
In the Eastern Church. So Origen, who commented on so much of the Scriptures, has nothing comments about this.
Right.
So.
The first manuscript we find it in the East is in the 900s. But it was very popular in the Western Church. Ambrose and Augustine championed it, and Jerome included it in the Vulgate.
No, we're looking at 4th, 5th century.
That's correct.
There.
That's correct.
But that's one of the ways that they know that this text was not just totally formed early on.
That's right.
In fact, that's one of the ways we know more about the Scriptures is out of the early systematic thinkers, and how they would quote long passages at times, or even short passages, and therefore that's one of the ways we are helped in reconstructing the text even.
That's right.
And being sure of what we've got there.
Exactly.
Well, let's look more particularly now, Ken, at this John 8, 1-11. It really is a familiar story overall, the woman taken in adultery. But let's look through it. You already start out by Jesus went out to the Mount of Olives, it begins. At daybreak, he reappeared in the temple area. And when the people started coming to him, he sat down and began to teach them. So we get some typical things here with Jesus. As you said, you related that to Luke's Gospel, went out to the Mount of Olives at daybreak, reappeared in the temple area, and so on. And I guess this idea of sitting down and then beginning to teach the people, we have that picture of Jesus as the rabbi, sort of an unofficial rabbi, but the teacher. In fact, in the Gospels we get that notion, right? The teacher says. So he was seen that way as the one who would teach the wisdom of the God. As we later on found out, Jesus said Jesus is the wisdom of the Father. He knows the secrets of the Father, and so he's going to begin to teach us about all of this. Is there anything in those early verses that you want to comment on?
I guess I would just emphasize or repeat what you had pointed out before. In chapter 21 of Luke's Gospel, where this passage in some manuscripts is found, it says there that Luke spent these last days of his life, he was lodging on the Mount of Olives during these last days, and that people used to come to him early in the morning to listen to him. And so the context here fits exactly with what chapter 21 of Luke's Gospel says.
Okay, then we move into, it says, the scribes and the Pharisees led a woman forward who had been caught in adultery. They made her stand there in front of everyone. Teacher, they said to him, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Then it goes on to say, in the law, Moses ordered such women to be stoned. What do you have to say about the case? Well, we get a typical thing here. The scribes and Pharisees linked together. As you said before, not typical of John's Gospel, but certainly in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, scribes and Pharisees listed together as people generally challenging Jesus and trying to trap him in one way or another. So we have the scribes and Pharisees. You want to comment on them at all?
Yes, I guess I would like to just add one further sentence that he goes on to say that they were posing this question to trap him, so they might have something to accuse him of. And I guess that's on the one hand, we have this picture, the very poignant picture, where the storyteller does a good job there. They made her stand there in front of everybody, just in one sentence, just captures that whole sad scene. But the structure of the scene is they're not really concerned about this woman at all. The scene has been created, the incident has been created in order to trap him. Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing then is, in what does the trap consist? Some have thought, well, that Jesus, throughout, especially Luke's gospel, but throughout the gospels, presents himself as a very compassionate man, a man who preaches God's forgiveness of sinners. And here he is presented with a cardinal case, a woman actually caught in the act of sinning. Now, what's he going to do about that? If he forgives her, then it looks like he's disregarding what the law itself said, and therefore he loses his credibility. On the other hand, if he says, yeah, let her have it, why, it shoots his image as someone who really does preach the compassion of God.
So that could possibly be the trap that they were springing for him here.
There's another possibility, too, and that is that many people think that the Romans forbade the Jewish authorities to carry out capital punishment after about the year 30 A.D., and so if that's the case, then they have a political trap for him here. If Jesus says that, yes, the woman should be stoned because she's violated the law, the group then would be a sort of a lynch mob in effect. Mm-hmm. Then he would get himself in trouble with the Roman authorities, and they would quickly put him out of business. On the other hand, if he acceded to the Roman situation and said, no, she should not be put to death, then he's gone again directly against what God's own word, inspired word from Mount Sinai, what the law said was that she should be stoned.
Let's look at the harshness of this for a moment. It said this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Moses ordered. Moses, was a great lawgiver. Especially like in the book of Deuteronomy and so on, seen in that way, is to be stoned. Killed for the act of adultery. This is a very harsh penalty. Do we know a lot about that historically? Whether that was ever, really carried out, or did they actually do that?
Yes, it was carried out. Leviticus simply says that such a woman is to be put to death. Deuteronomy provides that if a woman who's betrothed to a man commits adultery, she's to be stoned. Mm-hmm. And in this case, there is some evidence that Leviticus was read in the light of Deuteronomy, and such women were stoned. Later on, we're going to find out and said they were strangled, which is, I'm not sure if that's a better or worse, but yes, it was carried out.
That harsh penalty, and historically that was done, and evidently still at least was thought about being done in the time of Jesus.
That's right.
I wanted to pick up on your other thing, because you used an interesting date when you said it's thought that the Romans might be changing their mind on whether they're going to let their vassal state, that's not the right word, it's subservient state, is the Jewish world, have a capital punishment or not, because it bears very much on the Passion account of Jesus. And you use the date, year 30, and that's a date that's commonly thought of as the death date of Jesus, sometime in the year 30. Is that significant that around at that time that
it's an argument, or it's a position that's debated. Mm-hmm. We have kind of contradictory information here, and people put the information together in different ways. On the one hand, we have the archaeologists have discovered these warning blocks from the temple that says any non-Jew who enters beyond this point is going to take his life in his own hands. He will be killed, and we know the Romans permitted that. On the other hand, we have an incident later in the Acts of the Apostles, Acts, where the Jewish authorities put James to death, and we know from secular history that this happened during an interregnum of the Roman authorities. And when the new procurator came back, when the new procurator was appointed and took office, he deposed the high priest in charge at the time because they carried out that capital punishment, and they were not supposed to do that. The exact year that this would have gone into effect and what cases it would have covered is not clear. Mm-hmm. Later on, the case of the death of Stephen, also by stoning, there does not seem to have been any repercussions of that particular mm-hmm. incident, and leading some people to believe that when it came to matters of worship within the temple or within the synagogue itself, these capital punishment could be carried out, but not under other circumstances. Mm-hmm. In the Passion narrative, as you suggest, the implication of the Passion narrative is that the Jews could not, on their own, carry out the execution of Jesus, but had to turn him over to the Roman authorities and persuade Pilate that he was deserving to be killed according to Roman law rather than to Jewish law.
Right, that's sort of presupposed in the Passion account, isn't
Exactly.
it? Well, let's. So that you brought out the idea they were posing this question to trap him. That is, what are we supposed to do? Are we going to stone this woman or not? We got a couple possibilities of whatever the trap is. One with a more political sounding tone to it. The other is whether Jesus is going to be consistent with his own teaching of forgiveness and now having to face this. So now it goes on to say Jesus simply, interestingly, simply bent down and started tracing on the ground with his finger. When they persisted in their questioning, he straightened up and said to them, "Let the person among you who has no sin be the first to cast a stone at her." So then the story goes on. But let's see what we want to get out of this, Ken, here. He bent down, started tracing on the ground with his finger. Again, I know we have a lot of opinions about this, of what this passage means. I'm not sure we're going to get a definitive answer here.
That's right.
This is a toughie.
You're quite right. That has intrigued people since the beginning. What did he write? What was he actually doing on the ground there? The New American Bible Translation, tracing, implies by that first verb later on, he's going to be, in the second time he does it, he writes on the ground, and that implies words. In either case, some people have thought that he wrote specific passages from the Scripture that reminded people of the need to be just in their judgments and not to resort to false judgments. Especially the second time around, some people thought that he began writing down the sins of the people who were gathering around him.
The sentence to go on to read the passage says, then a second time he bent down and wrote, and the verb is different here, right. Wrote on the ground. Then the audience drifted away one by one, beginning with the elders. So,
a third possibility, which is alluded to or is kind of implied by the translation that he was tracing on the ground, is that Jesus was just doodling. And then that action itself could be interpreted a number of ways, sort of just a non-engagement in the effort, or a way of kind of making them feel very uncomfortable and putting them on the spot as well.
I must say that is not totally uncommon in terms of Jesus' answer to some questions.
Right. That's right.
That should you pay the tribute to Caesar or not?
Excellent example.
And you get a non-answer really if you don't really know what you're supposed to do about that afterwards. And it's a way of, I would say, very often what Jesus does is deepen the question, at least in his verbal responses. In other words, he doesn't answer the question at the level they're asking it, but he answers it in some way that forces you to think more deeply about it.
And
it could be
in
terms of your scribbling notion here. It could be a sort of, acted out message of the same type.
That's right.
Yeah.
One commentator that I thought showed a lot of sense in this whole issue said, A, we'll never know what he wrote on the ground,
right.
And B, that's probably significant. If the author, if John or Luke the author of this passage, had thought it was significant what he was writing, he would have mentioned it. He obviously did not think what he wrote was significant. It was just a fact that he did this.
Right, and then you get to the significant part of the whole story. Then the audience drifted away one by one, beginning with the elders, so they're not casting the first stone here. And this left him alone with the woman, who continued to stand there before him. Jesus finally straightened up again and said to her, I noticed that finally in there. Jesus finally straightened up again and said to her, Woman, where did they all disappear to? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she answered. Jesus said, Nor do I condemn you. You may go, but from now on, avoid this sin. So let's begin to look at this. The audience drifts away. Now, I think the important thing is happening here. Jesus is encountering the woman here, and we see Jesus at his best here, compassionate best. Still not condoning sin. That's for sure, because he says at the very end, from now on, avoid this sin. So, but the compassion for the person, I guess, is what comes across.
That's right. It's a very delicate balance, and well done in the sense that, as you say, he does not condone the sin, say that was just fine. On the other hand, he does not. The impression that you get is that the woman has learned her lesson. There's no point now in punishing her further. He is able to express the compassion of the Lord for the past sin and urge her to do more to do what she should do in the future. It's probably the part that the Eastern Church found very difficult was the fact that their penitential practices often lasted a very long time, that a person had to give very ample evidence that they had turned from their former life of sin to pick up the life of virtue that they were supposed to leave, and Jesus was able to do that in just almost instantaneously. That was probably difficult for them a difficult example for them to preach and have in their Gospels.
Because of that lengthier penitential
That's correct.
Idea that they had. But what there's a clear, obvious meaning that we want to get out of all of this, isn't there? I mean, that is that we are not supposed to be judgmental, that we're not supposed to be casting stones at people, that judgment is really God's work, not our work. I mean, it strikes me that that's, we don't want to miss that essential kind of meaning here. We see Jesus compassionate, forgiving, and us not to be judgmental.
That's right. He makes a familiar distinction that we make between the sin and the sinner. There's nothing in the whole passage that ever says that adultery is a fine thing or that it's an immaterial thing even. It remains a negative thing. But that question and judging that question is something different than judging the person who does it. The picture of Jesus here is quite consistent with what we find, for example, in Matthew's Gospel throughout the Gospels actually, but the Synoptics' message of taking the beam out of one's own eye before one presumes to make judgments about the splinters in another's eye.
There's a passage in Matthew 7, verse 1, "Judge not that you may not be judged," which has that same notion.
Or that the judgment with which you judge will be judged. You will be judged by the same judgment you make against another person. That same standard will be judged against you.
So, Ken, what we've seen here with some of the scholarly background you have provided so well for us here, the textual criticism and how we end up with this passage, the assurance that Jesus did indeed do something like this and say something like that, then we're able to grab onto the meaning, it seems to me, that Jesus appears as the compassionate one, totally and completely, dealing with the person, distinguishing the person from the sin, condemning the sin, but loving the sinner. It's a wonderful message for all of us. Ken, I'd like to speak with you a little bit about Passion Sunday, commonly called Palm Sunday, and talk a little bit about the liturgy for that day, and especially about the gospel account, the Passion account according to Luke, which has a distinctive flavor to it. I think it's often helpful to set the readings for the Mass in the context of the overall liturgy. And Palm Sunday, or Passion Sunday as we prefer to call it these days, really has a distinctive character. It opens with this gospel of Jesus coming into Jerusalem, the triumphal entry, as we say, and it's got sort of an upbeat character to it. The crowds are with him, and they're shouting, "Blessed be he who comes as King in the name of the Lord," and so on. And then you get a rather sudden shift of mood in the liturgy, and it becomes more somber. And now when we read passages from the Scriptures again, we are getting Isaiah 50 here, which is one of the suffering servant songs, as I'm recalling it, and it has a rather somber character to it. And then the Passion account, Luke 22 through 23, which is, of course, among the heavier things that we read in the Scripture. So there is that interesting mood shift that you find right within the liturgy itself, which is not unlike life itself, where we often move from highs to lows and where we have to find our ways to balance our successes and failures, and where the cross clearly is part of life, but for us always leading to resurrection. In one sense, I think that the mood is set that even when you go into the Passion account, let's not remember this moment of exhilaration that we had here, that we call this triumphal entry into Jerusalem.
You're correct, I think, in drawing attention to that. The scholars would say that what Jesus is doing here is doing a prophetic sign. The prophets were famous for finding actions that they could do, living long before Madison Avenue discovered the idea, that would be very dramatic and would catch people's attention and make them ask themselves, what's that mean? What's going on here? The prophet Zechariah had a prophecy in which he spoke to daughter Zion and said that she should see her king coming to her meek and humble, seated on an ass. And both Matthew and Mark, in particular, make a big deal of this. Jesus comes to Jerusalem, the capital of his country, both religious and political. He announces, in effect, that he indeed is the Messiah, but by acting out exactly what the prophet said, by riding meek and humbly into the city seated on an ass, he was making the point that he is not a warlike conquering general. That's not the kind of Messiah he is. Someone said you can't lead a cavalry charge from a burro.